The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the small coffee shop as Sarah Martinez wiped down the last table of the evening. Her Navy SEAL training had taught her to notice everything, but tonight felt different. Something in the air made her senses sharper than usual. She had been out of active duty for 2 years now, trying to build a normal life as a small business owner in Portland, Oregon. Sarah owned Harbor Grounds, a cozy coffee shop that had become a neighborhood favorite. The locals knew her as the friendly woman who made excellent lattes and always remembered their usual orders. What they didn't know was that before opening her shop, she had completed 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and had been part of some of the most dangerous missions the Navy SEALs had ever undertaken. At 32, Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence. Her brown hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held a depth that suggested she had seen more of the world than most people her age. She had learned to keep her military background private, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it often made people uncomfortable or they treated her differently once they knew. Tonight, as she counted the day's earnings, Sarah noticed a black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. Her training kicked in automatically. She memorized the license plate, noted the make and model, and observed that the engine was still running despite the car being stationary for so long. The last customer had left 20 minutes ago, and Sarah was preparing to close. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, but part of her mind remained focused on the car outside. In Afghanistan, this kind of surveillance often preceded an attack. She told herself she was being paranoid, that civilian life was different, but her instincts had kept her alive through multiple combat zones. As she turned off the main lights, leaving only the security lighting on, Sarah saw 3 men exit the black sedan. They moved with purpose, and she immediately recognized their body language. These weren't casual passers-by or potential customers. The way they positioned themselves around her shop, the coordinated timing of their approach, and the bulges under their jackets all told her the same thing: this was an operation. Sarah's heart rate remained steady as her training took over. She had faced far worse situations in hostile territory. The difference was that in Afghanistan, she had been armed and surrounded by her team. Here, she was alone with nothing but her wits and her skills. The first man approached the front door and tried the handle. Finding it locked, he signaled to his companions. One moved to the back of the building while the other positioned himself at the side window. Sarah realized they had done reconnaissance on her shop and knew the layout. This wasn't a random robbery attempt. She quickly moved to her office behind the counter and opened the safe where she kept the day's cash earnings. If this was about money, she would give them what they wanted and hope they would leave. But something told her this was about more than just robbery. The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the shop. They were coming in through the rear entrance, which meant they had likely disabled her alarm system. Sarah grabbed her cell phone to call 911, but before she could dial, the lights went out. They had cut the power. In the darkness, Sarah heard multiple sets of footsteps moving through her shop. They were using flashlights, their beams cutting through the black interior. She remained perfectly still behind the counter, controlling her breathing and listening to their movements. There were definitely 3 of them, and they were searching systematically. "She's here somewhere," one of them whispered. "The car's still in the parking lot." "Check the office," another voice responded. Sarah realized they knew exactly who they were looking for. This wasn't a random crime, they had come specifically for her. But why? She had left the military and had been living quietly for 2 years. She had no ongoing connections to any classified operations, and she had made no enemies in her civilian life. The beam of a flashlight swept across the counter above her head. Sarah remained motionless, her military training helping her stay calm under pressure. She had been in worse situations, hiding from enemy patrols in caves and bombed-out buildings. But this felt more personal somehow. These men had invaded her sanctuary, the peaceful life she had worked so hard to build. "Sarah Martinez," a voice called out. "We know you're here. Come out and this doesn't have to get ugly." The use of her name confirmed her worst suspicions. They weren't here by accident, and they weren't ordinary criminals. Someone had sent them specifically to find her. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Had someone from her past tracked her down? Was this connected to one of her missions in Afghanistan? She heard one of the men moving closer to her hiding spot. In the dim light filtering in from the street, she could see his silhouette. He was tall and heavily built, wearing dark clothing and moving with the careful steps of someone trained in tactical operations. These weren't amateurs. Sarah knew she had seconds before they would discover her location. She had two choices: surrender and hope for the best, or use her training to fight back. The rational part of her mind said to give up peacefully, but her instincts warned her that these men hadn't come just to talk. The decision was made for her when she heard one of them say, "Boss wants this done quietly. No witnesses." Sarah's blood ran cold. Whatever this was about, they weren't planning to let her walk away. She thought about the life she had built here, the customers who had become friends, the sense of peace she had finally found after years of war. She wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. As the first man rounded the counter, Sarah was ready. Her 2 years of civilian life hadn't dulled her reflexes or her training. She was still a Navy SEAL, and these men were about to learn what that meant. The rain continued to fall outside, masking any sounds that might carry to the neighboring buildings. Inside harbor grounds, a different kind of storm was about to begin. Sarah had survived enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and some of the most dangerous missions the military had to offer. 3 men in her coffee shop were about to discover that threatening a Navy SEAL was a mistake they would never forget. Her hand moved to the tactical knife she still carried on her belt, a habit from her military days that she had never broken. The first man was close enough now that she could smell his cologne and hear his breathing. Sarah took a deep breath, centered herself, and prepared to fight for her life and the peaceful existence she had worked so hard to create. The confrontation was about to begin, and Sarah knew that before this night was over, these men would understand why you never threaten someone who has been trained to be one of the world's most elite warriors. Her story of survival was about to take a dramatic and dangerous turn. The first attacker rounded the counter with his weapon drawn, expecting to find a frightened business owner cowering in the dark. Instead, Sarah exploded into action with the precision and speed that had made her one of the Navy's most effective operators. Her tactical knife found its mark before he could even process what was happening. The man dropped his flashlight and weapon, clutching his wounded arm as he stumbled backward in shock. "What the hell?" he gasped, but Sarah was already moving. She rolled across the floor and retrieved his dropped pistol, her muscle memory taking over as if she had never left the battlefield. The other 2 men heard the commotion and came running, their flashlights cutting chaotic patterns through the darkness as they tried to locate the source of their partner's distress. "She's armed," the wounded man shouted. "This isn't some regular civilian." Sarah used their momentary confusion to her advantage. She knew every inch of her coffee shop, every table, every corner, every potential cover. This was her territory now, and she had the tactical advantage despite being outnumbered. She moved silently between the tables, using the furniture as cover while her attackers fumbled in the unfamiliar space. The second man appeared at the end of the counter, his weapon raised and ready to fire. But Sarah was no longer where he expected her to be. She had circled around behind him, moving with the stealth that had allowed her to complete dozens of reconnaissance missions without detection. Her training kicked in automatically as she disarmed him with a swift, precise movement that sent his gun clattering across the floor. Before he could react, Sarah had him in a chokehold. "Who sent you?" she whispered in his ear, her voice deadly calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man struggled against her grip, but Sarah's training had taught her exactly how much pressure to apply. She could render him unconscious in seconds or worse if necessary. "I'm not going to ask again," she said. We were just supposed to bring you in," he gasped. "Someone wants to talk to you." "About what?" Sarah tightened her hold slightly. "Afghanistan, something about a mission you were on. They said you had information they needed." Sarah's mind raced. There had been many missions in Afghanistan, some of them classified at levels she couldn't even discuss with her own family. But she had debriefed thoroughly when she left the service. What could someone want with her now, 2 years later? The third attacker had found a position behind the espresso machine and was trying to get a clear shot. Sarah could hear him moving equipment, looking for an angle that wouldn't risk hitting his partner. She had seconds before he found his opportunity. She released the second man and shoved him toward his partner's position, using him as a human shield while she moved to better cover. The third man held his fire, unwilling to shoot through his own teammate. "This is crazy," the second man shouted. "You said she was just some coffee shop owner." "Intelligence was wrong," the third man replied grimly. "Dead wrong." Sarah realized that whoever had sent these men didn't know about her military background. They had expected to find an easy target, someone who could be intimidated or easily captured. The fact that they were surprised by her capabilities told her something important about who was behind this. She decided to use their confusion to gather more information. "You're right," she called out from behind an overturned table. "I'm not just a coffee shop owner. I'm someone you really don't want to mess with. Tell me who sent you and maybe we can work this out." "We can't do that," the third man replied. "But if you come with us peacefully, no one else has to get hurt." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. They were the ones who had broken into her shop, threatened her life, and now they were asking her to surrender peacefully. "That's not happening," she said. "But I'll give you one chance to walk away. Leave now and I won't follow you." The response was immediate. The third man opened fire, his bullets splintering the wooden table Sarah was using for cover. She rolled to new position as chunks of wood and plaster rained down around her. These men weren't interested in negotiating. Sarah's training took over completely. She was no longer Sarah the coffee shop owner, she was Petty Officer Martinez, Navy SEAL, in a combat situation with hostile forces. The cozy interior of harbor grounds transformed in her mind into another battlefield, no different from the compounds and buildings she had cleared in Afghanistan. She moved with fluid precision, using every piece of furniture, every shadow, every angle to her advantage. The first attacker, still nursing his wounded arm, was trying to flank her from the left. The second was attempting to get behind the counter where she had initially hidden. The third maintained his position near the espresso machine, providing covering fire. Sarah had faced worse odds in enemy territory. These men were skilled, but they weren't Navy SEALs. They hadn't spent years training for this kind of close-quarters combat. They hadn't survived multiple deployments in some of the world's most dangerous locations. She reached into her memory of the shop's layout and found her opportunity. There was a circuit breaker box near the back entrance they had used to enter. If she could reach it and restore power, the sudden illumination would give her a tactical advantage. These men had adapted to fighting in the dark, but the shock of sudden bright light would temporarily blind them and disrupt their night vision. Moving carefully from cover to cover, Sarah made her way toward the back of the shop. She could hear the men communicating in whispers, trying to coordinate their movements. They were good, but they were making the classic mistake of underestimating their opponent. As she reached the circuit breaker, Sarah heard one of them getting closer. She flipped the main switch and the coffee shop exploded into brilliant light. The sudden illumination was exactly the distraction she needed. The first attacker, temporarily blinded, stumbled into a chair and fell. Sarah was on him immediately, securing his weapon and using zip ties from her supply closet to restrain him. The second man, disoriented by the sudden light change, made the mistake of exposing himself from behind the counter. Sarah's military precision allowed her to disarm and subdue him before he could adjust to the new lighting conditions. The third man, however, had been partially shielded behind the espresso machine. He emerged with his weapon ready, but now he could see that his two partners were down and Sarah was no longer the helpless victim they had expected to find. "You're military," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Navy SEAL," Sarah replied, standing confidently in the middle of her coffee shop, now looking like the warrior she had always been. "And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The man's face went pale as the implications hit him. Navy SEALs were legendary for their training and capabilities. He had been sent to capture what he thought was a civilian business owner, and, instead, he had walked into a trap with one of the military's most elite operators. "This changes things," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it does," Sarah agreed. "Now you're going to tell me exactly who sent you and why, or this situation is going to get much worse for you and your friends." The man looked at his two subdued partners, then back at Sarah. She could see him calculating his chances, weighing his options. He was realizing that this mission had gone completely wrong from the moment they had broken in. Sarah stepped closer, and he could see in her eyes the same deadly competence that had allowed her to survive multiple combat deployments. This wasn't just a woman defending her business, this was a trained killer who had been pushed too far. The rain continued to fall outside, and, in the bright lights of the coffee shop, the true confrontation was about to begin. Sarah was no longer the hunted, she had become the hunter, and these men were about to learn exactly why you never threaten a Navy SEAL. The remaining attacker lowered his weapon slightly, his face showing the first signs of genuine fear. Sarah could see the exact moment when the reality of his situation hit him. He had come expecting easy prey and, instead, found himself facing someone whose training made her more dangerous than he could have imagined. "My name is Marcus Chen," he said slowly. "I work for a private military contractor called Blackwater Dynamics. We were hired to bring you in for questioning about Operation Desert Mirage." Sarah's blood ran cold. Desert Mirage had been one of her most classified missions, a joint operation between Navy SEALs and CIA operatives that had taken place in the mountains of Afghanistan 3 years ago. The mission had officially never happened, buried so deep in classified files that even mentioning it was a federal crime. "That operation is classified beyond your clearance level," Sarah said, her voice deadly serious. "Who hired your company?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at his two subdued partners. Both men were conscious but restrained, watching the conversation with growing alarm. They were beginning to understand that they had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple extraction job. "A man named Director Hamilton," Marcus finally admitted. "He said you had information about missing assets from that mission. Something about weapons that never made it back to base." Sarah's mind raced back to that night in the Afghan mountains. Operation Desert Mirage had been a raid on a Taliban weapons cache hidden in cave systems near the Pakistan border. Intelligence had indicated the presence of advanced American weapons that had been captured from previous operations. The mission was to recover those weapons before they could be used against coalition forces. But something had gone wrong. The intelligence had been accurate about the location, but when Sarah's team had arrived, they found much more than just recovered American weapons. The caves contained a sophisticated arms dealing operation, with weapons from multiple countries and buyers from various terrorist organizations. During the firefight that followed, several team members had been wounded, and, in the chaos of extraction, some equipment had been left behind. Sarah remembered specifically that they had been forced to abandon several cases of advanced electronics and communication equipment when their helicopter came under heavy fire. "I reported everything that happened on that mission," Sarah said. "There was a full debrief when we returned to base. Hamilton says some of the weapons were never accounted for," Marcus replied. "He thinks you might have information about where they ended up." Sarah studied Marcus's face, looking for signs of deception. Her training had taught her to read people, and she could see that he believed what he was telling her. But something didn't feel right about the whole situation. "Hamilton isn't a name I recognize from that operation," she said. "And Blackwater Dynamics isn't a company the military would use for this kind of investigation." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah caught the tell. He was hiding something, or perhaps he didn't have the full picture himself. "Look, I'm just a contractor," he said. "They gave us your photo, your address, and told us to bring you in for questioning. We weren't supposed to hurt you, just convince you to come with us. By breaking into my business and threatening me with guns?" Sarah's voice carried the edge of controlled anger. "That's not asking for a meeting. That's kidnapping." The wounded attacker, still holding his injured arm, spoke up for the first time since the fight began. "This whole thing is screwed up, Marcus. She's military. We should have been told." "Shut up, Rodriguez," Marcus snapped, but the damage was done. Sarah now had a second name and confirmation that their intelligence had been deliberately incomplete. "So your employers sent you to kidnap someone without telling you she was a Navy SEAL," Sarah said. "Either they're incredibly incompetent, or they set you up to fail." Marcus was beginning to look troubled. Professional contractors didn't survive long by taking jobs with incomplete information, and the more Sarah talked, the more he realized how badly his team had been misled. Sarah decided to press her advantage. "Tell me about Director Hamilton. Where did you meet him? How did he contact you?" "Electronic communication mostly," Marcus admitted. "Encrypted emails, secure phone calls. We never met him in person." "Did you verify his credentials? Check his government ID?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. These men were supposed to be professionals, but they had been manipulated like amateurs. "You've been played," she told him bluntly. "Someone used you to get to me, and they didn't care if you got hurt in the process." The second attacker, who had been quiet since Sarah restrained him, finally spoke. "She's right, Marcus. Think about it. Why wouldn't they tell us she was military? Why didn't they provide backup? This whole job was designed to fail." Sarah could see doubt spreading across Marcus's face. Good contractors developed instincts about their employers, and those instincts were telling him that something was very wrong with this mission. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, taking control of the situation. "You're going to contact this Hamilton person and tell him you couldn't find me. You're going to disappear and never come back here." "We can't do that," Marcus protested. "We have a contract. If we don't deliver, there will be consequences." "The consequences of trying to kidnap a Navy SEAL are worse than whatever your fake employer might do," Sarah replied. "Trust me on that." Marcus looked around the coffee shop, taking in the overturned furniture, the bullet holes in the walls, and his two subdued partners. The evidence of how badly this mission had gone wrong was everywhere. "Even if we wanted to walk away, Hamilton will know something went wrong," he said. "Our communications have been monitored. He'll know we failed." Sarah considered this information. If their employer was monitoring communications, then he would indeed know that the mission had failed. That meant he might send another team, or worse, come after Sarah directly. "Then, we need to give him a reason to back off permanently," Sarah said. "Tell me everything you know about this Hamilton character, and I'll make sure he understands that pursuing me is not in his best interests." For the next hour, Sarah interrogated the three men systematically. She learned that Blackwater Dynamics was a legitimate private military company, but the job had come through unusual channels. Hamilton had bypassed their normal client verification process and had paid a significant premium for immediate action. The more details emerged, the more convinced Sarah became that this Hamilton was either not who he claimed to be, or was acting outside official channels. No legitimate government investigation would be conducted this way, and no real intelligence officer would send contractors in blind against a former Navy SEAL. As dawn began to break outside, Sarah had a decision to make. She could call the police and have these men arrested, but that would create an official record that might alert their employer. Or she could let them go with a message that would hopefully end this threat permanently. "Here's what's going to happen," she finally said. "You're going to tell Hamilton that you found me, but I'm not the person he's looking for. Tell him I never served in Afghanistan, that your intelligence was wrong. Make it clear that pursuing this further will only waste his time and money." Marcus nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't believe us?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then, he'll learn the hard way that some people are better left alone. I've spent years in places where people disappear for asking the wrong questions. If this Hamilton wants to keep playing games, I can play too." The threat was clear, and all three men understood it. They were looking at someone who had the training, the connections, and the willingness to make serious problems disappear. As the men prepared to leave, Sarah made one final point. "If you're smart, you'll find a new line of work.
Contractors who take jobs without proper intelligence don't live very long in this business.
Marcus gathered his wounded partners and headed for the door, but he turned back before leaving. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your shop.
We were told this would be simple.
Nothing involving Navy SEALs is ever simple, Sarah replied.
Remember that for next time.
As the men departed, Sarah surveyed the damage to her peaceful coffee shop. Bullet holes scarred the walls, furniture was overturned, and the carefully crafted atmosphere of her civilian sanctuary had been shattered. But she was alive, she had protected herself, and she had sent a clear message to whoever was behind this attack. The question now was whether that message would be enough, or if this Hamilton person would escalate the situation further. Sarah began cleaning up the damage, but part of her mind was already planning. If someone wanted to bring her military past into her civilian life, she would be ready for them. She had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless dangerous missions. One mysterious director and his hired contractors were not going to destroy the peace she had worked so hard to build. 3 days after the attack on her coffee shop, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was professional, authoritative, and completely unexpected.
Ms. Martinez, this is Deputy Director Karen Walsh from the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to talk.
Sarah had been expecting another confrontation with Hamilton or his contractors, not a call from legitimate government intelligence. She agreed to meet Deputy Director Walsh at a secure location in downtown Portland, bringing with her all the information she had gathered about the attack. The meeting location was a nondescript office building that housed several federal agencies. Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of dealing with classified information and dangerous situations. First, let me apologize for what happened to you, Walsh began as they sat in a sterile conference room.
The men who attacked you were not working on behalf of any legitimate government agency. Sarah leaned forward, interested. Then, who was behind it?
A man named Thomas Hamilton, former CIA operative who was discharged 3 years ago for unauthorized operations, Walsh explained. He's been running private intelligence gathering using stolen government credentials and false flag operations.
The pieces began falling into place for Sarah. Operation Desert Mirage? Hamilton was the CIA liaison on that mission, Walsh confirmed. When the operation went sideways and equipment was left behind, he was tasked with the recovery effort.
Instead of reporting what actually happened, he filed false reports and kept the missing equipment for his own purposes.
Sarah remembered Hamilton now.
He had been the CIA operative who had provided the initial intelligence for the mission, but he hadn't been present during the actual operation. She had never met him face to face, which explained why his name hadn't been familiar when the contractors mentioned it.
So the missing weapons, Sarah began,
were recovered by Hamilton's team, but never turned over to proper authorities, Walsh finished. He's been selling them on the black market for 3 years. When an internal audit finally caught up with the discrepancies, we started investigating.
The scope of Hamilton's deception was becoming clear.
He had used his position to steal military equipment, falsify reports, and then, when the investigation got close, he had tried to frame Sarah and possibly other members of her team for the missing weapons. The contractors who attacked you were hired under false pretenses, Walsh continued. Hamilton told them you had stolen the weapons and were selling them yourself. He planned to have you kidnapped and forced to confess to his crimes.
Sarah felt a cold anger building inside her.
Hamilton had not only stolen military equipment but had been willing to destroy innocent people's lives to cover up his crimes. The contractors who had attacked her were criminals, but they had also been victims of Hamilton's manipulation.
Where is Hamilton now? Sarah asked.
In federal custody, Walsh replied with satisfaction.
We arrested him yesterday morning along with several associates.
The evidence you provided about the attack on your coffee shop was the final piece we needed to build our case. Sarah was relieved but also concerned about the future.
What about other members of my team? Are they in danger?
Hamilton's focus was primarily on you because you were the team leader and he thought you would be the most likely to have detailed knowledge of what was left behind, Walsh explained. We've contacted the other team members as a precaution, but we believe the threat is over.
As the meeting concluded, Walsh made an unexpected offer.
The DIA has been impressed with how you handled this situation. Your military record speaks for itself, and your actions over the past few days demonstrate that your skills haven't diminished.
We could use someone with your capabilities. Sarah considered the offer carefully.
For 2 years, she had been trying to build a peaceful civilian life, but recent events had reminded her of the satisfaction she had found in serving her country and protecting others from threats they couldn't handle themselves. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said finally, but I need some time to think about it.
I've built something important here in Portland. Walsh nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open.
Sarah returned to her coffee shop that evening to find something unexpected. Despite having been closed for 3 days while she dealt with federal investigators, there were flowers and cards from customers covering the front door. Word had somehow spread through the neighborhood that Harbor Grounds had been the target of a break-in, and the community had rallied to support her. As she read through the messages, Sarah realized how much her civilian life meant to her and to others. Mrs. Chen, who came in every morning for her cappuccino, had written a note saying the shop was the highlight of her daily routine. The college students who studied at her tables had left a card signed by dozens of people, thanking her for creating a space where they felt safe and welcome. But there was one message that stood out above all the others. It was from Marcus Chen, the contractor who had led the attack on her shop. His note was brief but significant. Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that my team and I have resigned from Blackwater Dynamics. What happened was wrong, and we're sorry we were part of it. I hope you can rebuild what we damaged. You deserve better than what we brought to your door. Sarah smiled as she read the note. Even in the midst of a dangerous situation, she had managed to reach these men and help them understand that they had been manipulated. Marcus and his team were skilled operators who had been used by a criminal, and now they had a chance to find legitimate work with ethical employers. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked to repair the damage to her coffee shop. The bullet holes were patched, the furniture was replaced, and slowly the atmosphere of peace and community was restored. But something had changed in Sarah herself. The attack had reminded her that there were people in the world who preyed on others, who used their skills and resources to hurt innocent people for personal gain. She had spent years fighting such people in Afghanistan, and now she realized that the fight continued here at home in different forms. When Deputy Director Walsh called again 2 weeks later, Sarah was ready with her answer. I'm interested in your offer, Sarah said, but with conditions.
What kind of conditions?
Walsh asked. I want to keep my coffee shop, Sarah explained.
It's important to me and to my community.
But I'm willing to work as a consultant for the DIA on operations that require my specific skills.
Part-time, as needed.
Walsh was quiet for a moment, then laughed.
A Navy SEAL who runs a coffee shop as cover for intelligence work? I think we can make that arrangement. 6 months later, Harbor Grounds was busier than ever.
Sarah had hired additional staff to help run the shop while she was away on consulting assignments. To her regular customers, she was still just the friendly coffee shop owner who made excellent lattes and always remembered their orders. But several times a month, Sarah received encrypted communications that took her to places where her unique skills were needed. Sometimes it was training other operatives, sometimes it was consulting on overseas operations, and occasionally it was dealing with threats that required someone with her particular combination of combat experience and intelligence. The attack on her coffee shop had taught Sarah an important lesson: you could leave the military, but the mission of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them never really ended. The difference was that now she got to choose her battles and fight them on her own terms.
Thomas Hamilton was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his crimes.
The stolen weapons were recovered and returned to military custody. The contractors who had attacked Sarah found legitimate work with ethical companies and went on to have successful careers. And Sarah continued to serve both her community and her country, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers in foreign lands, but by ordinary citizens who refuse to let others be victimized by those who abuse their power. The sign above harbor grounds still read the same as it always had, welcoming customers to a cozy neighborhood coffee shop. But those who knew Sarah's story understood that it represented something more, a place where someone who had given years of service to her country continued to serve in her own way, protecting the peace and community she had worked so hard to build. On quiet evenings when the last customer had left and Sarah was cleaning up for the night, she sometimes reflected on how different her life could have been if she had handled that attack differently. But she never regretted her choices. She had defended herself, protected her community, and found a way to continue serving something larger than herself. The rain still fell on Portland streets, customers still came for their morning coffee, and life went on much as it always had. But Sarah knew that beneath the surface of ordinary civilian life, there were people working to keep others safe from threats they would never know existed. And sometimes, those guardians served the best coffee in town.